My name is Serena Davenport, and I was 34. The year my stepmother locked me out of my own father's funeral. For 3 months, she kept me from his bedside while he was dying. Then at the reception in his house, she stood up in front of every relative we had and announced that my dad had left her the whole estate, a $70 million mansion, and most of what came with it. Then she told my brother and me to get out. I didn't cry. I laughed. She thought a locked door was the end of it. By the next morning, I had already driven to the one building in the county that could prove her wrong. Welcome back to Calm Drama. Stories where ordinary people meet impossible families and answer cruelty with steadiness instead of noise. Stories about quiet people who refuse to be erased are your kind of story. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. For the last 3 months of his life, I called my dad every single night. Most nights the phone rang twice and went dead. When someone did answer, it was never him. It was Lorraine, my stepmother, telling me he was asleep or too tired or that his doctor wanted the visitors kept down because his immune system was shot. Some nights it was her daughter Belle who would say the same thing in a flatter voice and hang up. First, I am a logistics officer by training. 8 years in the Army taught me one habit that never left. I write everything down. So I kept a small notebook by the phone, the same kind I used to track freight, and I logged each. I called date, time, who answered, what they said. The page filled up fast. 1. Sunday, I gave up on the phone and drove the 90 minutes to the house. I knew the side door code by heart. The code didn't work. I knocked and the door opened up. Width of a brass security chain. Bella's face appeared in the gap, calm as a closed window. I asked to see my father. She said he was resting and that I should have thought about him sooner. Then she said the thing I would hear again and again, the line that still lands like a slap. Real family doesn't show up only at the end. She slid the chain back into its track. I stood on the steps and listened to it scrape home, that small metal sound. And I thought I didn't show up at the end. You wouldn't let me show up at all. I drove home with the notebook on the passenger seat and one question I couldn't answer. What is a wife so afraid of that she bolts the door against a man's own children? To know why that question mattered, you have to know my father. Harlan Davenport built a building supply company out of one rented truck and 40 years of getting up before the sun. He was not a soft man, but he was a fair one. My mother, Ruth, died when I was 22, and after that, he raised the two of us mostly by example. He taught me to measure twice and cut once. He taught me that a handshake you have to explain isn't worth much. And he had this thing he said about the big house he'd finally bought, the one with the iron gates and the long gravel drive. A house isn't bricks, he'd tell us. It's the people in it. Bricks you can lose. His study smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. Even years after his doctor made him quit the pipe, I can still find that smell with my eyes closed. He kept files on everything. Tax records back to the 70s, warranty cards, the receipt for my first bicycle when I was a teenager. Rolling my eyes at the cabinets, he laughed and pointed at me. You're the one who keeps the paperwork. You always did. He wasn't wrong. I keep the paperwork the way other people keep grudges. That was the strange cold comfort underneath my grief in those weeks. My father documented everything, sorted everything, signed everything in front of the right people. He did not leave loose ends. So whatever Lorraine was building behind that chain door, it had to be built on something he'd signed. and a man that careful does not. Hand his life's work to one person on A. Whisper, he kept everything, which is exactly why none of what came next should have been possible. Lorraine came into my father's life 6 years before he died. I want to be honest about this part because it would be easy to tell you I hated her on sight. I didn't. He'd been alone a long time, and she was warm and quick, and she made him laugh at dinner. The first year I was glad. A widower at 65 rattling around a house that size. Ideburia. About him. So when he started showing up to holidays with a woman who fussed over his cholesterol and held his arm on the steps, part of me exhaled. The trouble came in slowly, the way water finds a basement. Little things she reorganized. His phone, and somehow my number ended up 3 taps deep. She started handling his calendar, then his mail, then gently his money. She'd answer questions I asked him. She'd remember plans we'd made and tell me he'd forgotten making. None of it was a crime. All of it added up. I knew almost nothing about her past, except one evening my father let something slip over coffee. Her first marriage had ended badly. There had been a bankruptcy, a house lost, a long bad stretch she didn't talk about. He said it kindly, the way he said most things. I filed it away without knowing why at the time. It just made me feel for her. Later, it would explain everything because a person who has once watched the floor open under her feet will do almost anything to make sure it never opens again. I didn't understand yet what she was so afraid of, but I was about to learn that fear, the deep kind, doesn't always make people gentle. Sometimes it makes them ruthless, and it dresses their ruthlessness up as love. The call about the diagnosis came on A Tuesday in March. Pancreatic cancer. Already spread. The kind of sentence where the doctors start talking in months instead of years. For the first few weeks, things were almost normal. I took leave from my company and drove up. Twice a week, I'd sit with Dad in the study and we'd watch the gravel drive. And not say much. Caleb, my younger brother, came nearly every day after school. He teaches shop at the high school 20 minutes from the house. Then the rules changed. First it was visiting hours, which is a strange thing to have in your own father's home. Then it was a typed letter taped to the side. Door signed by a doctor saying that for his safety, the patient's exposure to visitors should be limited. Caleb got turned away in the driveway twice. I got the chain. I didn't just sit there and take it either. I called the oncologist's office to ask about the restriction. I asked the hospice agency who was authorized to visit. I wrote down every answer, but Lorraine was his wife. Legally, she ran that house and his care, and a hospice team is not going to force its way past a spouse who's waving a doctor's note. The barrier wasn't my passivity. It was her position and the law that backed it. One afternoon, I caught the hospice nurse, Marin Holloway, by her car at the end of the drive. She looked both ways before she spoke, which told me plenty. She said my father was lucid, that his mind was clear right to the end. Then she said the thing that made my hands go cold. He asks about you both every day. So if he was asking for us, who exactly had decided he didn't want to see us? A few weeks before, he got too weak too. Right, an envelope showed up in my mailbox in my father's handwriting. I knew the slant of his letters before I knew my own name. Inside there was no card, no long goodbye, just a single line on a torn half sheet of his stationery. Keep the paperwork. You always did. Folded into the page was his Army Challenge coin, the one he carried since before I was born. Worn smooth on one edge from 40 years in his pocket. I held it in the truck for a long time. I'm not a crier, but I sat in that parking lot until the windows fogged. I read his note as a tease, the same joke from when I was 16. His way of reaching across the distance Lorraine had built. I did not read it as instructions. That's the part one can't forgive myself for. He was telling me something plainly the way he told me everything, and I drove home instead of driving to him. I told myself I'd see him that weekend. I told myself the chain would come off if I just stayed patient and polite. I had spent my whole life being the responsible one, the one who handled things alone and didn't make a scene. And for once, that instinct failed me completely. Patient and polite got me a locked door and a phone that went to voicemail. By the weekend, he'd slipped past the point of talking. I never got the conversation that envelope was trying to start for months. Afterward, I kept the coin in my pocket and turned it over with my thumb. Whenever the guilt rose up, why would a dying man with so little energy left spend some of it reminding me about paperwork? I would find out, just not in time to tell him I'd understood. He died at 4 in the morning on a Thursday in January. I didn't get the call until almost 9. By the time the phone rang, Lorraine had already chosen. The funeral home picked the casket and set the date. She told me all of this in a tone you'd use to confirm a dentist appointment. I stood in my kitchen with the coffee going cold and felt the floor tilt. Not grief, not yet. The grief came later and stayed long. What I felt first was the particular numbness of being handed a finished thing you weren't allowed to be part of. My father raised me. He taught me to drive on a back road in his old pickup, and I learned he was gone the way you'd learn. A package was delivered. Caleb called 20 minutes later, his voice shredded. He'd driven over the second he heard and been kept at the gate while strangers in dark coats came and went. We agreed to go up together for the service. I packed a bag for one night, my good coat and the folder, always the folder. I need to stop here for a second. If you've ever been kept from someone you love while a stranger held the door, you already know exactly how this feels in the chest. Talk, subscribe, and stay with me, because what happened at that funeral is the part one. Still can't quite believe, and the part that finally woke me all the way up. We drove up the morning of the funeral, Caleb in the passenger seat, turning my father's coin over in his hand because I'd given it to him to hold. The iron gates were open for the cars. The house looked exactly like it always had, gray stone and tall windows, except for one thing I noticed on the steps. I went to the side door out of habit, the family door, the one I'd used my whole life. I reached for the handle, and it didn't give. The lock was new, bright brass, where the old worn one had been. The metal still factory clean. First the chain, now a different lock entirely. They'd had the locks changed on the house before they buried him. Inside, the foyer was full of black coats and low voices, and the tall grandfather clock by the stairs struck the hour the way it had at every Christmas of my childhood. Belle stood near the door with a stack of cream-colored cards, place cards directing people to seats. She handed Caleb and me ours without quite looking at us, back row behind. Cousins we hadn't seen in a decade. One of those cousins, a great aunt named Corrali, who'd never liked my mother, leaned toward me as I passed and murmured that we really should have come around more while he was alive. The whole room had clearly been told a story, and in that story, we were the children who'd abandoned him. I felt the old urge to explain, to pull out my notebook and show them the dates. I didn't. You don't want a room like that. With a notebook. I told myself one thing. As I sat down in the back, stay calm. I had no idea Lorraine was about to make staying calm the hardest thing I'd ever done. After the service, everyone moved back to the house for the reception. Caterers, a long table of food nobody ate, that hush people use when they're waiting to leave. I was standing by the window in the front room when Lorraine tapped a glass with a spoon. The talk died down. She'd changed into a dove. Gray dress, and she stood at the foot of the staircase like she was hosting a benefit, one hand resting on the new post my father used to hang his hat on. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about love and devotion and being the one who stays. Then she said, as many of you know, Harlan and I built our life here together, and I want you to hear it from me. He left this house and the heart of his estate to the wife who stood beside him to the very end. A murmur went around the room, warm, sympathetic, aimed at her. She let it settle. Then she found my eyes across the room and held them. This house, she said, was never really yours. He chose me. Beside her, a heavy set man in a brown suit nodded along. Gerald Pratt, the attorney, I'd learned, and added that the will was properly executed and notarized, all in order. I watched my own relatives turn to look at us with something close to pity. Caleb's face went red from the collar up. My first feeling wasn't rage. It was a kind of disbelief that anyone would gamble this publicly, this completely on a single piece of paper, because here is what I knew, standing there in my good coat with a folder under my arm. My father did not leave loose ends, and A will only matters if it controls. The thing it claims to give away was that. Well, even real, and did it cover the one thing she was so sure she'd won? Lorraine wasn't finished. With the room still warm toward her, she turned to Caleb and me and lowered her voice too. That gentle, terrible register people use when they want everyone to overhear. She said she thought it would be best if we collected ourselves and left before the reading of the eulogies. This is my home now, she said. You understand? Belle was already moving toward the front door to open it. The way an usher shows you out of a theater. Caleb stood up so fast his chair scraped. I watched his jaw work, watched him gather a whole afternoon of grief into one sentence he was about to throw across the room. I put my hand on his shoulder and pressed down gently, and he sat. And then, in the worst possible moment, in front of every relative we had, I laughed. It wasn't loud. It was almost soft, more breath than sound. But in that silent room, it carried. Lorraine's composure flickered. People stared. I wasn't laughing because anything was funny. I was laughing because I had just understood the size of her mistake. She had stood in front of 40 witnesses and bet a $70 million house on a piece of paper she clearly never read carefully, and she had no idea what my father had signed years before she ever knocked on his door. I stood, took Caleb's arm, and walked us both out the front door past Belle's smirk and the brass lock and the chain. The door shut behind us. For a second, we just stood on the gravel in the cold. Caleb turned to me, furious and lost. "Why are you smiling?" he said. "We just got thrown out." I looked back at the house my father built, because she just made this easy, I said. She picked the one fight I know how to win. In the car, Caleb wanted to burn it all down. He wanted to call every cousin and tell them the truth about the chained door. He wanted to post the whole timeline online. The calls, the dates, the note from the doctor that never let us in. I understood the impulse. I felt it too. hot and clean, but I'd spent 8 years learning that the loudest soldier in the room is rarely the one who wins. The argument, we don't fight her with. Noise, I told him, we fight her with. Records. Noise feels good for one night. Paper lasts. I laid it out for him while I drove the same way I plan a convoy. First, a probate attorney, somebody who does will contests and nothing else. Second, the county recorder's office, where every deed in the county is filed and stamped and dated and open to anyone who walks in. Third, whatever notary stamped that will of hers, because A, notary keeps a journal by law, and journals can be subpoenaed. Caleb stared at me. You think the wills fake, he said. I think I said that Dad was the most careful man either of us ever knew, and careful men leave a paper trail you can follow. I didn't tell him everything yet. I didn't tell him about the line in the envelope or the thing. I'd known about that house for 9 years and never had a reason to mention. I just drove and let the plan settle over. Both of us like a blanket, because there was one document in this whole mess that Lorraine could not have forged, no matter how good her attorney was. It had been filed and recorded years before she ever existed to us. And first thing in the morning, I was going to go get a certified copy of it. The probate attorney's name was Tom Reyes, and he had the calm, unhurried manner of a man who has watched 100 families tear themselves apart over furniture. I sat across his desk the next week with my folder and laid out the timeline. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he told me the rules, and he was careful to keep them honest. I can't promise you how a judge rules, he said, but I can tell you how the clock works in our state, if that will God admitted. To probate, he explained, the window to contest, it was short, a matter of months, not years. The grounds for a contest were specific: forgery, undue, influence, lack of capacity, or improper execution, isolating a dying man from his children, controlling his phone and his money, then producing a will that hands everything to the person doing the isolating. That pattern had a name in his world, and judges knew it when they saw it. Then he leaned forward and asked the question that mattered most. Did your father actually own that house in his own name? Because a will can only give away what the dead personally owned. I let myself smile for the first time in days, not for the last 9 years. I said, Tom's pen stopped moving. He asked me to explain. I told him I'd say it better with the document in my hand, and that I was driving to the recorder's office that afternoon. He nodded slowly, and I could see him recalculating the way you do when a case you thought was uphill suddenly turns flat. If that's true, he said, then her big announcement at the funeral was theater. The question is what else they will try to grab, and whether the will itself can stand at all. Before I drove to the recorder, Tom had me build the rest of the file, and that meant turning 3 months of pain into evidence. I copied on my call log every dated entry, who answered, and what they said. I wrote a clean statement of the times Caleb was turned away in the driveway. Then I called Marin Holloway, the hospice nurse, and asked if she'd be willing to put on paper what she'd told me by her car. She didn't hesitate. She said my father had been clear-minded until very near the end, that he'd asked for his children, and that she'd watched his visitors get controlled in a way that troubled her enough to remember the dates. A nurse's documented account of a patient's clarity and isolation is the kind of thing a court takes seriously. It isn't gossip, and it isn't a recording made in secret. It's a professional's record. The last piece was that doctor's note, the typed letter that had appeared on the side. door restricting visitors.
Eat it.
Photographed it weeks earlier, again out. Of pure habit, looking at it now with cold eyes, the signature looked wrong. The doctor's name was real, but the loops of the signature didn't match the prescriptions I'd seen him sign. Pattern by pattern, the shape of it came clear. Isolation, control of the money. A beneficiary, who also happened to be the gatekeeper. Tom called it the classic profile of undue influence and told me that in cases like ours, when the person who benefits is also the one pulling the strings, a court will look very hard at how that will got made. I had the pattern. Now I needed the one document that turned the pattern into a wall she couldn't climb. The next morning I drove to the county recorder's office and asked for the title history on the house. The county recorder's office is a beige room with a counter and a hum from the copy machines, and it is one of my favorite places on earth because nothing in it cares how you feel. Facts only, stamped and dated. I told the clerk I needed the full chain of title on my father's property and gave her the parcel number from an old tax bill in my folder. She typed for a minute, frowned, then printed several pages and slid them across the counter. There it was, recorded 9 years earlier. The document I'd been carrying in the back of my mind since the day my father told me about it over coffee. A grant deed, transferring the entire property out of his own name and into the Davenport family trust. Recorded county stamp in the corner, date and time printed across the top where anyone in the world could read it for the price of a copy. Under the trust, the beneficiaries were named. Plainly his 2 children, the successor. Trustee, the person who would manage it when he was gone, was me. My father had done this 2 years after my mother died, when he was healthy and sharp and years away from ever meeting Lorraine. I stood at that counter and held the cool page in both hands and finally understood the envelope. Keep the paperwork. You always did. He hadn't been teasing me. He'd been pointing me here. The thing Lorraine never thought to check. The thing her expensive attorney never checked was the most public record there is, because the house had been in the trust for 9 years. It was never part of the estate her will claimed to give away. You cannot leave someone a house that you do not personally own. Her grand announcement at the funeral had been a queen's speech, delivered over an empty throne. But I wasn't done, and I knew it. The will still reached for everything else my father left behind, and worse, it reached for the story of who he was. A fake piece of paper was telling the world my father had thrown his children away, that I could not let stand. I brought the certified deed to Tom Reyes and watched him read it twice. This is clean, he said. The house was never hers to claim. That part's almost simple. Then he set it down and gave me the harder truth. The house being safe didn't make the fight over. That will still try to sweep up everything that wasn't locked inside the trust. The bank accounts, my father's shares in the company he built, the cars, the investment accounts, and it did something worse than grab money. It rewrote him. A will admitted to probate becomes the official legal last word on what a person wanted. If that forged document stood, then the public record of my father's life would say forever that Harlan Davenport looked at his 2 children and chose to leave them. Nothing that a stranger of 6 years meant more to him than the daughter he taught to drive and the son who came every day after school until they barred the gate. I'm not doing this for the accounts, I told Tom. She can keep her version for one afternoon at a funeral. She doesn't get to keep it forever. He nodded slowly. He understood. To kill the will and clear my father's name. We couldn't just prove the house was in trust. We had to prove the will itself was a fraud, the forged signature, the impossible day it was supposedly signed, the conflict of the man who drafted and notarized it that meant discovery, subpoenas, a forensic examiner of months, of grinding work against a woman who'd already told the whole county her side. Tom warned me it would be expensive and slow. I thought about my father sitting alone behind that chained door asking for us every day, and I told Tom to file. Some things you spend whatever it costs. To make right, the first subpoena went to Gerald Pratt for his notary journal. By law, a notary keeps a bound record of everything they notarize, who appeared, when, what identification they showed. It is exactly the kind of paper trail I love because it pins a person to a specific claim on a specific day. When the journal came back, Tom spread it on the table next to two other timelines, and we lined up the dates. The journal said my father had personally appeared before Gerald Pratt and signed his new. Well, on a Tuesday in late November, I pulled Marin Holloway's hospice notes for that same Tuesday. On that day, her records showed my father had been sedated and largely unresponsive, deep in the hard part of the end, not receiving visitors at all. The two pieces of paper could not both be true. A man cannot be too sedated to recognize his own daughter and also be sitting upright in a lawyer's office signing his name with a steady hand. There was more. Gerald Pratt hadn't just notarized the will. He drafted it, and the will named him executor with a fat executive's fee attached to a $70 million estate. The man who wrote the document, the man who stamped it, and the man who stood to profit from it were all the same man. Tom explained carefully that in our state, a court can presume undue influence when the person who benefits is also the one who prepared the instrument, and that the burden then shifts to them to prove it was clean. I looked at the two impossible dates side by side. So, either Dad rose from a sedated bed to sign, I said, or somebody signed for him. Tom didn't answer. He just circled the date and read whose hand had actually held that pen. To answer that, we hired a forensic document examiner, a quiet woman named Patricia, who'd spent 30 years telling courts whether ink told the truth. She needed known samples of my father's real signature, the more the better, from around the same period. This is where my whole strange life of keeping paper finally paid for itself. I had his signature on the recorded deed. I had it on the note from the envelope, that last torn half sheet. I had it on tax filings, on the title to the old pickup, on a birthday card from the year before. Patricia laid them out alongside the signature on the new will and worked for 2 weeks with a loop and a camera. When her preliminary report came, it was written in the careful, hedged language experts use, but the meaning underneath was plain. The signature on the will was not consistent with the known samples. It showed the hallmarks of a simulation, a hand copying a shape rather than writing its own name, tremor in the wrong places. Pen lifts where my father never lifted, pressure that started and stopped like someone tracing. My father wrote his name 10,000 times the same confident way. The name on that will had been drawn by someone working slowly. Watching a model, I sat with that report. A long time, part of me had hoped right up to then that there was some innocent explanation that grief had made me suspicious. There wasn't. Someone had forged my dying father's name to steal his life's work and erase his children from a story. If you're still with me, thank you. This next part is why I've kept every receipt of my whole life. Before we walk into that courtroom tab, like so more people see how this turned out, then stay because Lorraine's still thought she was winning. While we built our file in quiet rooms, Lorraine spent those same months acting like the war was already over. Word got back to us through the cousins, the ones who still spoke to Caleb. She'd started clearing out my father's study. She put his desk and his reading chair up for sale and changed the name on the household accounts. She had Belle posting photographs from inside the house, the two of them on the wide stone steps, captions about new beginnings and blessings. One cousin told me gently that the study didn't even smell the same anymore. Lorraine had filled it with those thick scented candles, vanilla and synthetic musk, and underneath them, the cedar and pipe. Tobacco that had been my father for 60 years was simply gone. That detail stayed with me longer than any of the money. She wasn't just taking the house. She was scrubbing him out of it when Tom's first filing landed and she finally understood we weren't going away. She sent a message through Gerald that I'll never forget. She told him to tell me that I should think hard about what I was starting. You can't afford this fight, Serena. The message said, I can wait you out. She wasn't entirely wrong about the money. Litigation against a $70 million estate is not cheap, and she knew Caleb taught shop, and I ran a small freight company. She was betting that grief plus legal bills would make us fold the way most families. It's a good bet. Usually most people can't stomach years of it. What she didn't factor in was that I wasn't planning to outspend her. I was planning to outdocument her, and the most important document already had a county stamp on it. Let her wait. The clock she was relying on was the same one running against her. There was one afternoon I almost felt sorry for her. Tom had arranged for me to collect a few personal items. The trust clearly entitled me to my mother's wedding ring, some photographs, my father's coins twin he'd kept in the desk. Lorraine wasn't supposed to be home. She was. I found her in the kitchen at the long table, and she didn't hear me at first. The table was covered in paper, but not the kind I deal in. Old paper, past due notices in. Faded envelopes, a foreclosure letter. Soft with handling bank statements from years back with red ink across the bottom. Her hands were shaking as she sorted them, and she was talking to herself very low. Not again, she said. Not back to nothing. Not again. And for 1 second, I saw the whole shape of her. A woman who had once lost everything, who had felt the floor open, and who had decided she would never ever feel it again, no matter who she had to walk out to stay safe. I understood her then. I genuinely did. I could pity the fear that drove her. But she looked up and saw me, and whatever softness had been on her face snapped shut like that brass chain. She stood, gathered the old letters against her chest, and said the thing that ended my pity for good. Your brother is going to walk away from this with nothing, she said. I'll make sure of it. Cold and flat, aimed at the gentlest person I know. And there it was. I could feel sorry for the woman who'd been poor and scared. I could not feel sorry for the woman who'd bolted the door against a dying man's children and would now reach across the table to hurt my brother just to win. The fear explained the door. It did not excuse it. Around the 5th month, Caleb wanted to quit. I didn't blame him. The legal bills had eaten his summer savings. Half. The family wouldn't return his calls, and the other half kept asking why he was dragging the family name through court instead of letting his grieving stepmother have her peace. He came over one night and sat at my kitchen table, looking 10 years older than 30. Maybe we just let her have it, he said. The house, the money, all of it. I don't even want it. I just want to stop. Feeling like this, I let him say it. Then I reached into the drawer and put two things on the table between us. The certified deed and our father's torn note. Keep the paperwork. You always did. I reminded him what Maren Holloway told me by her car. That Dad asked for. Us every single day, right to the end. While a stranger told us he didn't want to see us. This was never really about the house, Caleb. I said the house was already ours the day Dad signed that deed 9 years ago. This is about the lie. She's telling the whole county that Dad threw us away. If we quit now, that lie becomes the official record. It becomes the truth. Caleb's eyes filled. He picked up the note and read it again. That single line in our father's hand. He didn't say anything for a long minute. Then he sat it down, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and nodded once, the way he used to nod before a wrestling match in high school, when he decided not to lose. Okay, he said, then we finish it. I put the papers back in the drawer. The hearing was 3 weeks out. Discovery has a way of turning over rocks, and under one of them, we found the doctor's note. I'd always thought that typed letter on the side door was the ugliest thing in the whole affair, because it was the instrument that kept us away while he was still alive. Tom subpoenaed the oncologist's office for their records, including any visitor restrictions they'd ever issued for my father. Their answer came back short and devastating. The practice had never issued any such letter. They had no record of recommending that visitors be limited. The physician's office confirmed in writing that the signature on the letter, taped to the door, was not his. It had been forged the same way the will had been forged by someone who needed a piece of official-looking paper to do a cruel and deliberate job. That changed the shape of everything. The forged will was a theft of money and reputation, but the forged doctor's note was proof of intent. It showed that the isolation hadn't been an accident of a sick man's wishes or an overcautious vows. Someone had manufactured medical authority for the specific purpose of keeping us out, and had done it months before the will was ever signed. It was a plan executed in stages with fake paper at every step. When Tom told me I had to walk outside and stand in the cold for a while, all those nights I sat with my notebook by the phone, blaming myself for being too patient, too polite. I hadn't failed to push hard enough. I've been fighting a wall built on forgery, and no amount of pushing gets you past a lie wearing a doctor's signature. The guilt I'd carried for months loosened its grip just slightly. I went back inside and added the letter to the file. 2 weeks before the hearing, the offer came. Gerald Pratt called Tom and proposed a settlement, and on paper it looked generous. Split the contested estate down the middle. Everyone walks away. No trial. There was one condition. We'd sign a confidentiality agreement. No public findings. No mention of forgery. No statement on the record about how the will was made or how my father had been kept from us. Lorraine would keep her good name in the county, and the official story would simply be that two families reached a quiet, amicable agreement. Tom laid it out plainly and told me it was my decision. He reminded me that trials are uncertain, that even a strong case can break in a courtroom, that the money on offer was real and the money at trial was not guaranteed. I thought about it for one night. I understood the appeal. It was the safe, responsible, conflict-avoiding move, the kind I had made my whole life. And that was exactly why I said no, because the money was never the point. confidentiality agreement would lock the lie in place. It would let Lorraine keep telling the version where my father chose her over his children. Only now, with my signature paying for her silence. I don't want more than my father gave us, I told Tom. I want the truth he'd recognize if we went to that. Hearing the deed, the impossible dates, the forged signatures, all of it would go on the public record where anyone could read it for the price of a copy. The same place my father had hidden the
Dun, 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 dun.